Admittedly, 1967 was a rough year for Shelby American. The company was in serious debt and was struggling to get out. The introduction of the GT500 was a boon to the car's reputation and sales, but production woes really hurt the company. Shelby American had plans for a 1968 Shelby, but had not anticipated the Ford takeover. However, that didn't deter a businessman like Carroll Shelby. Fresh off a second 24 Hours of Le Mans win, he was neck-deep in the GT40 program that was gearing up for another run at Le Mans. But he still was after building the ultimate Grand Tourer. Unfortunately, it seemed that the demographic for Shelby buyers had changed. Shelby's vision had young, upwardly mobile professionals who fancy Ferraris flocking to Ford dealerships, trading in their 275 GTB for GT350. The kind of professionals that would enjoy the rumble of the exhaust on the way to the office during the week and the squeal of the tires eating up the track at Willow Springs on the weekends. In reality, Shelbys were being purchased by middle-aged professionals who wanted to look stylish in a cool car as opposed to driving that car and enjoying it to its fullest. At the close of the 67 model year, Ford had stepped in and taken control of Shelby American. Their first order of business was to dissolve the company and create three new ones: Shelby Automotive Company, Shelby Parts Company, and Shelby Racing Company. Shelby Automotive was moved to Southfield, Michigan. Shelby Racing Company and Shelby Parts Company moved to Torrance, California, with Shelby Parts Company later renamed Shelby Autosports and moved to Detroit. If those changes weren't enough, Ford welcomed in new president Bunky Knudsen, fresh in from his resignation from GM. The word around the office was that Bunky didn't like Shelby, primarily due to the fact that Shelby would beat Bunky's Corvettes more often than not. That meant that Knudsen worked less and less with Shelby and concentrated his efforts on building up Ford's own performance brand. With Ford calling the shots over Shelby Automotive, Carroll Shelby didn't have the amount of control over the direction of the car that he did in previous years. Shelby still had plenty of input when it came to the design aspects of the new Shelby, but Ford had the final say. It was the 67 model that he said he was most proud of, as it was the closest to building a road car that he would ever get through Ford. The 68 model was the beginning of Shelby's vision being pulled away from what he had intended. In spite of the corporate changes, Shelby Automotive moved forward with production of GT350s, GT500s, and a mid-year offering that we'll revisit a little later, the GT500 KR. Before Ford stepped in, the team at Shelby American had already begun to work on the 68 model. One of those designers was none other than John Chun, an immigrant who escaped North Korea to the United States. A graduate of Art Center in California, he was rejected by Ford because he was deemed to be too old. However, with the exit of Charles McHose shortly after the body pieces for the 67 were designed, the team at Shelby was welcoming to John. Working as a part of Shelby's design team, John was a big part of bringing Carroll Shelby's ideas and desires to fruition. With his skill and some preliminary sketches from McHose before he left, it wasn't long before the team had a working design for 1968. Carroll then contacted Gene Bordenat, head of Ford Styling Center, to where they then took the sketches and drawings and gave them form. The base 68 Mustang hadn't changed much from the 67 body, with the exception of a few refinements. The look of the 68 Shelby, though, would definitely benefit from some more distinguishing differences. The biggest difference being the front end. The 1967 model was the first deviation from sticking with 100% Mustang sheet metal, and it's safe to say that the 67 Shelby was a definite hit. Unfortunately, the 67 Shelby production was plagued with delay after delay due to the fiberglass parts. Their first major snag was the fiberglass nose. The body they used to make the prototype pieces was used by Ford for seatbelt testing and therefore was twisted unbeknownst to anyone. This problem wasn't made known until it was time to assemble the cars. The noses were off enough for every section to require bodywork to fit. A.O. Smith Plastics was contracted to come up with a temporary two-piece nose that helped to keep production alive until they can get things back on track. In addition to the ill-fitting body pieces, Shelby American employed the use of several companies to supply their fiberglass pieces, leading to inconsistent production and pieces that differed depending on who manufactured them. Speaking of fiberglass production, in spite of the improved looks and longer hood and nose provided, they would tend to bow over time, cheapening the overall look of the car. By the time Ford took over Shelby American, Fred Goodell and John Kerr were discussing finding a new sole supplier of fiberglass parts, as well as a contractor that could assemble the 68 model year run of Shelbys. Someone that could handle a decent production run of cars, somewhere between 6 and 12,000. After some discussion, it was revealed that Kerr used his connection at Smith Plastics Division, a subsidiary of A.O. Smith Corporation. At the time, A.O. Smith was the main supplier of Corvette bodies for Chevrolet, but their contract was about to end. Goodell and Smith toured their facility and were impressed with the size, but also with their manufacturing process. Instead of laying resin and fiberglass in a mold, Smith Plastics used a process called matched metal molding or compression molding. This process not only produced OEM quality fiberglass pieces that are high quality and strong, but it also produces these pieces much faster with consistent quality from the first to the very last piece. In addition, A.O. Smith was able to produce the body pieces in the quantities they were looking for, as well as performing the final paint and assembly, producing finished cars. The cars themselves would come from Ford's Metuchen assembly plant in New Jersey, a big change from the San Jose plant. It only made sense since Shelby Automotive now operated out of Michigan and not Los Angeles. For 1968, Shelby's solution was to produce a front end that was longer but didn't hang out there in empty space. Instead, it was supported by the headlight buckets and the front header panel. Sporting the Shelby name in chrome letters, the nose flowed into a reshaped front valance that created a large air intake right in front with the chrome trim ring. The center-mounted high beams in 67 were problematic. For starters, they were illegal in some states, causing Shelby American to move the lights outboard. Second, adding a set of separate high beams required additional wiring, which cost time and money. For the 68 model year, Shelby Automotive kept the standard Mustang 2 headlight setup and added a pair of Marshall driving lamps inside the grille opening just above the bumper. After production began, the Marshall lamps were found to be illegal in California and Pennsylvania, so they were switched to Lucas lamps. These lights were mounted outboard, of course. The hood itself was also redesigned to incorporate larger air scoops placed further forward for a more aggressive look with hood louvers near the rear. In 67, the louvers were added sporadically. For 68, they would be standard on every Shelby. Although the hoods utilized the factory Mustang hood latch, they were also supplied with a pair of Zeus fastener twist-down hood pins that gave the front end a finished look. All Shelbys came with bright wheel well moldings as well as bright rocker moldings. In the midst of all the changes to the company, with production and the overall design of the car, the name of the car was also changed. Before, they were always referred to as Shelby Mustangs. At the same time, Shelby American was producing the Cobra Roadster. However, Cobra production stopped for 1968. With the Cobra name being owned by Ford, they were allowed to add the Cobra name to whatever they wanted. So they added it to the Shelby Mustang, thus changing the name to Cobra GT350 and Cobra GT500. On the fastback model, the upper air extractors appeared to be direct carryovers from the previous year, but they were actually new designs that were very similar to the 67 models and operated the same way. The brake scoops were also very similar, but again, new designs. The biggest difference between these and the 67 model is that none of the brake scoops were functional. The next big difference came in the back of the car. The trunk lid with molded-in spoiler remained pretty much the same with slight differences. It was completely remade by A.O. Smith with their new manufacturing process. The trunk lid was also finished off with Shelby lettering. Also for 68 was an all-new trunk lid with integral spoiler for convertibles. The Cougar taillights were dumped in favor of deemed better-looking 1965 Thunderbird taillights that featured sequentially blinking turn signals. Yet another cool mod that was found to be illegal in certain states. Shelby Automotive offered kits to remedy the situation for those Shelby owners who ran afoul of the law, but completely eliminated the sequential blinking during production. The new taillights were installed with a new taillight panel painted argent silver. Something new this year were side marker lights. The front lights were mounted on the lower front fender ahead of the front wheel, while the rear marker lights resided closer to the belt line on the rear quarters. Mid-year, they were changed from a rectangle to more of an elongated hexagon due to a change by Ford. The entire package was finished off with a rocker panel stripe for either the GT350 or GT500. For 68, the lettering was once again centered on the front fender. The big news for 68 production was the introduction of a new convertible model. They kicked the idea around in 66, teased it in 67, but 1968 was the debut. Sporting all of the same bodywork that was able to be transferred over, the Shelby convertible was stunning. Starting with the same aggressive look of the fastback, the convertible added a bit more character with the drop top offered in either black or white. The most noticeable component was the roll bar. Encased in rubber, it gave the car a look of a Targa roof with a pair of metal eyelets on top to provide tie-down points for surfboards. Instead of a bar-mounted shoulder harness, Shelby Automotive developed a cross-chest shoulder strap for a bit of added safety over a simple lap belt. The Shelby for 68 was offered in 7 standard colors: Candy Apple Red, Acapulco Blue, Highland Green, Lime Gold, Wimbledon White, Sunlit Gold, and Raven Black. There were also 6 special colors known as Special Paint Cars: WT6066 Yellow, WT4017 Red, WT7081 Green, WT5185 Orange, WT5014 Orange, and WT5017 Orange. These special colors may have been part of a sales promotion, but it's not clear. Of these special colors, the WT6066 Yellow is the most plentiful because during the production of the Sunlit Gold cars, it was found out that the paint didn't match exactly, meaning that all of the body parts installed by A.O. Smith were off a shade and extremely noticeable. So early in the production run, the Sunlit Gold color was replaced by the WT6066 Yellow. The change was made early enough that by the time the GT500 came along, Sunlit Gold was non-existent. There were also 3 cars painted Royal Maroon, 2 painted Brittany Blue, and 1 painted Meadowlark Yellow. Fun fact, there were no GT500s painted yellow in any shade. There were yellow KRs, but no regular GT500s. Wimbledon White cars received a blue rocker panel stripe, yellow cars received a black stripe, and all other colors a white stripe. Any rally stripes were painted on at the dealer. The interior was offered in 2 colors, black or saddle, and was treated to a more luxurious feel over the 67 model. While the 67 models enjoyed a deluxe interior, things were stepped up for 68. For starters, all of the brushed aluminum was exchanged for simulated walnut. One new addition for 68 was tilt steering that made its way to all Shelbys except the very early models. Ford developed a new 2-spoke energy-absorbing wheel for 68, and in keeping with the plan of using as few aftermarket pieces as possible, Shelby kept the steering wheel, but with the new Cobra emblem. The passenger side of the dash also showed off a new Cobra emblem paired with either GT350 or GT500. The seats were the Mustang Deluxe front seats with fold-down rear seats. Ford ditched the overhead console of 67 for a more traditional and functional between-the-seats console, which worked perfectly for Shelby. Shelby's console was different from the Mustang unit. It honestly flowed better than Ford's. Lined with carpet and stitched vinyl on top with a simulated walnut insert, it's equipped with clips to hold the seatbelt latches. It travels a link between the front seats and ends up in a padded armrest embossed with yet another Cobra. Instead of a storage compartment like the Mustang, the Shelby features a pair of amp and oil gauges, the same as the previous year since the gauge layout is the same. The gauges look more at home within the console, as opposed to hanging below the dash as before. The fastback interior sported a roll bar with shoulder harnesses, just like last year, with slight differences, including beefed up mounting points and a shoulder harness that could unhook from the inertia reel. Overall, Shelby interiors were unique, plush, and functional. The solid lifter 271 horsepower 289 hypo was discontinued by Ford in the Mustang, leaving a gap in performance engines. Shelby Automotive went with Ford's replacement, a hydraulic lifter 302 for the new GT350. In the Mustang, the 302 came with a cast iron intake and Autolite 450 CFM 4-barrel carburetor for a maximum output of 230 horsepower. Except for the very early models, all 302 equipped GT350s received an Offenhauser dual-plane 4-barrel aluminum intake with a Holley 600 CFM carburetor for an overall output of 250 horsepower with stock Mustang exhaust manifolds and Mustang exhaust system. Power ran through either a 4-speed top-loader manual or C4 automatic transmission. Power was transmitted to the ground via a 9-inch open differential with either 350 or 389 gears. The GT500 used the same special interceptor 428 from 1967. If me calling it a special interceptor instead of a police interceptor makes your eyes twitch, then remember from the video on the 1967 Shelby. The standard police interceptor engine was too wide for the engine bay and was modified with a pair of 390 GT cylinder heads in order to use the Mustang exhaust manifolds, making it a special interceptor. The biggest change for 1968 was the switch from dual quads to a single 735 CFM 4-barrel Holley and aluminum intake. The intakes came from the factory painted the engine color, but over the years, either through restoration or modification, you'll see bare aluminum versions now. Horsepower was increased to 360 while still using the stock Mustang exhaust system. Transmission choices were the 4-speed manual top loader or the C6 automatic. All GT500s left the factory with either a 3-to-1 or 350 open rear diff. The suspension was designed for a confident ride with the occasional hot lap. Thus, the front springs were beefed up slightly with Ford's high-rate coil springs and high-capacity heavy-duty adjustable shocks. It was more of the same in the rear with Ford's upgraded leaf springs and rear shocks. The front sway bar was just shy of an inch diameter at 0.94 inches. Brakes received the biggest change as Ford stepped away from the 4-piston Kelsey Hayes calipers in favor of a cheaper-to-produce single-piston sliding caliper setup with heavy-duty drums in the rear. Not exactly the best setup for Sebring, but plenty for the street. All Shelby brake and steering systems were power-assisted. All of the cars left Shelby with 15x7 steel wheels wrapped in Goodyear E70-15 tires. The wheels themselves were adorned with special 2-piece wheel covers manufactured by Garwood Industries. You may see similar wheel covers on certain Mopars and GM cars of the time, but they were 14-inch versions. It's safe to say that these wheel covers work very well with the 68 Shelbys. The optional wheel for 68 was the 10-spoke wheel from 67. Unfortunately, it was discovered that they didn't clear the new single-piston brake calipers without machining for clearance. Thus, all 68 Shelbys, except for 3, left the factory with the Garwood wheel covers. Anyone wanting the 10-spoke wheels had to do a little massaging to make them fit. Over the years, the 10-spoke wheels have been reproduced by varying manufacturers, and most have been designed to clear the brakes. Yet some retain the original factory specs. With 1968 being smack dab in the middle of the muscle car era, It's safe to bet to speculate that Ford was right in the thick of things. They made the Mustang larger in 1967 to accommodate their 390 FE big block, but to be honest, it just couldn't keep up with some of the small block, let alone big block competitors. The 390 was a truck engine at best. The 427, being a rare and expensive option, was a race engine and not suited for daily driving. The 427 single overhead cam was out of the question, and while using the 428 police interceptor was a decent idea, it didn't just simply bolt in without modification. Enter Bob Tasca Sr., a Rhode Island Ford dealership owner and lover of drag racing. The name of Tasca has adorned the sides of fast cars since the early 1960s and still does to this day. Remember the 1963 Fairlane Thunderbolt? You can thank Tasca Ford for that. Early Mustang funny cars like Mystery 7 and Mystery 9? Tasca Ford. Well, Bob had a pretty good relationship with the upper management at Ford and was constantly lobbying Ford's top brass to dump the 390 in favor of a 428. All while applying the pressure to Ford, Bob's son, Bobby Tasca, was busy trying to rescue his 67 GT350 Mustang from being a boat anchor in late 1966. Being a dealership known for turning out performance cars, it was known the 390 was in need of some serious help, and Bobby wanted to make sure that his Mustang was always one step ahead of the local Mopars and Chevys. In his efforts in trying to squeeze out every available horse in his GT390 engine, the stretched out 390 inadvertently blew up. Tasca went to his mechanic and Tasca drag team original member, Bill Gilbert, for a solution. If Ford wasn't going to build a 428 Mustang, then perhaps they could come up with one. Taking a 428 Police Interceptor short block, Gilbert slapped on a pair of 427 low-riser heads, a dual quad intake, and custom headers. It was enough to make Bobby's 67 very respectable on the streets. So much so that Bob Singer named the car the King of the Road 1968, or KR8 for short. At the same time Tasca Ford was working on their project, Ford engineers had taken heed to Bob Tasca's lobbying and began to focus on entering the muscle car wars, starting with the performance big block of their own. Headed up by Bill Barr in January of 1967, Ford engineers started work on a brand new performance engine that was eventually named the Cobra Jet, using the 428 passenger car engine as a foundation. During development, Ford came up with several versions to play with, and Jacques Pacino, Ford's marketing manager, bet Bob Tasca lunch that Ford's test car was faster than Tasca's KR8. Who could turn down such a challenge? Tasca showed up with the KR8, and Ford's test Mustang was sporting a 427 block with a 428 crank, 427 heads, and a 780 Holly. The final displacement was a stroked out 447 cubes. Needless to say, Ford's entry soundly beat the KR8 3 out of 3, but all was not lost. Ford requested to keep Tasca's engine for comparative testing. In exchange, Tasca left in the KR8 with a 427 tunnel port under the hood. The Cobra Jet program continued working on the new 428. A lot of people like to insinuate that a 428 Cobra Jet is pretty much the KR8 engine, but Ford engineers went through a ton of research and development to design new components. According to the 428 Cobra Jet registry, there are more than 30 design differences between the two engines. You can check out the differences on their website, 428cobrajet.org. The 428 block received new flat-top pistons, beefed-up connecting rods, newly designed cast-iron cylinder heads and intake, along with the newly developed 780 CFM Holley 4-barrel carb, while using the 390 GT camshaft. The exhaust manifolds were also designed specially for the Cobra Jet. The KR8, as well as Bob Tasca Sr., were no doubt major influences, but the 428 Cobra Jet was its own engine. At a 10.6 to 1 compression ratio, it was rated at a paltry 335 horsepower, but the output was actually in the low 400s. The new big block made its debut at the NHRA Winter Nationals in January 1968. Ford showed up with 6 Cobra Jet-equipped 1968.5 Mustangs, to which 4 made it to their respective class finals. The Superstock Eliminator class was an all Cobra Jet race with Al Jonak defeating Hubert Platt for the title. With the introduction of the 68.5 428 Cobra Jet Mustang, it was only a matter of time before we saw a Shelby version of it. It's only right. With this new engine option, the 428 Special Interceptor was dropped, and the 428 Cobra Jet became the only big block engine choice for the GT500. However, they couldn't just add Ford's hottest engine and keep the same boring name. So Shelby Automotive added the letters KR, standing for King of the Road, in homage of Tasca's KR8 Mustang. I mean, we probably wouldn't have had such an engine were it not for the constant pressure applied by Bob Tasca Sr., so the name was a fitting tribute. There is also the story that Carroll Shelby heard of a new Corvette model coming out that was to be called King of the Road. Shelby, always being one to capitalize on a good opportunity, called his lawyer and inquired if GM had trademarked the name, to which the reply was no, thus allowing Shelby to beat GM to the punch. In addition, there's the story that the car was named after the song King of the Road by Roger Miller. I wasn't there, so I don't know which story is true, if any of them are, although I tend to lean towards it being a tribute to the KR8 Mustang. There were other upgrades that came along with the Cobra Jet engine. The shock towers were beefed up for strength, 4-speed cars received staggered rear shocks, the rear gears were the same as the GT500, 3-to-1 or 350-to-1, although all KRs left their factory equipped with a traction lock differential, except for automatic AC-equipped cars. The hood was upgraded with ductwork to seal the scoops to the air cleaner, making it a true ram air setup. Along with the improved flow of the Cobra Jet exhaust manifolds, the exhaust system was upgraded to 2.5-inch diameter versus the 2-inch pipes. They still ran through a transverse muffler, but exited the rear valance via quad tips, different from the single baloney cut tips on the GT350s and non-KR 500s. The KRs also came from the factory equipped with Blackwall Goodyear Speedway Specials instead of the raised white letter tires. The lettering on the rocker panel stripe was also different. The current font used was called Micro Gamma Extended Bold, used since 1965. Unfortunately, adding the KR to the end made it too long for the space provided, requiring a change to Sans Copperplate Gothic Bold for the GT500 KR stripes only. On the dashboard, the GT500 badge was changed to say Cobra Jet. The rear gas cap door that said Shelby Cobra was also changed to Cobra Jet. The final touch was a 428 Cobra Jet badge on the front fenders. The trademark Shelby coiled snake that's normally there was modified by removing the Cobra insignia, leaving the snake. With a 14.8 quarter-mile time, the GT500 KR wasn't necessarily bully on the drag strip, but Shelby never really built cars for drag racing. With the lack of competition vehicles, it really wasn't known as a corner carver either. So why call it King of the Road? Well, this is only my opinion, but let's go back to the 1967 model. This is the car Shelby said he was most proud of. He was looking to build a road car out of the Shelby, and I believe that he had the underpinnings required, as well as the look and luxury needed. However, the 428 Special Interceptor, while still producing 355 horsepower, could have been so much more had he been able to equip it with something like the Cobra Jet. I believe the car would have been near perfect for Shelby. The 68 KR, on the other hand, had the looks, luxury, power, and maybe some of the underpinnings required, but shared a lot of components with the Mustang. I mean, of course, all Shelby Mustangs share a great deal of components with Mustangs, but I believe Carroll Shelby really wanted to take the car to another level with options like EFI and independent rear suspension. More on that later. Regardless, the 68 KR was the best all-around driver's car offered by Shelby Automotive. The GT500 KR remains one of the most sought-after Shelbys, and a well-restored or clean survivor can potentially go into the deep six figures at auction. With each model year brings experimental models and prototypes. Since the very beginning, Shelby was constantly on a quest to be on the cutting edge of performance, style, and technology. We had the 428 GT350, final top cars, 427 cars, but the most popular at the time was Little Red, hands down. Officially known as EXP500, it was a red, fast, big block car, and according to Fred Goodell, just downright fun to drive. For 1968, Shelby Automotive debuted the 1968 model of their EXP500, this time nicknamed the Green Hornet. The Green Hornet served as a test bed for a plethora of items. It began life as a lime gold 390 coupe and was outfitted with Thunderbird taillights, Marshall fog lamps, and side scoops and a deck lid spoiler. Very similar to a Shelby Convertible, but minus the front fiberglass and being a coupe. It became the prototype for Ford's California Special and High Country Special. Afterwards, it was sent to Shelby Automotive, where it received the proper Shelby front bodywork and painted dark green metallic. The Green Hornet was one of the first cars to receive an experimental 428 Cobra Jet. It also received an independent rear suspension, four-wheel disc brakes, and for the first time, electronic fuel injection. Fuel injection? IRS? We must be talking about possibly an S650 Mustang, right? Nope. The folks at Shelby really were looking at pushing the Shelby out there ahead of most of what was on the street at the time. If only they had gotten their wish. Let's take a look at the rear suspension first. It actually began life as a prototype for the 1965 Mustang. Carroll Shelby actually worked with Ford engineers during the pre-GT350 days. They used the 1964 Falcon as a test bed, since the Mustang shares the same chassis layout. Using designers like Klaus Arning, it was a 4-link setup that attached to the chassis using the leaf spring mounting points, complete with a 9-inch center section. Unfortunately, the system never made it to production. However, it lived on as the very suspension that found its way to Shelby Automotive and under the Green Hornet. Interesting side note, the rear suspension design ended up in the capable hands of the original Venice crew, a team of former Shelby American employees who are building official continuation 65 GT350R models as well as special 65 GT350 Roadsters, all featuring an updated version of the original IRS. Perhaps one day we'll try to do a video on them. Independent rear suspension in a 1960s Mustang was pretty impressive. However, the Conelec fuel injection system was the star of the show. Like IRS, fuel injection around that time wasn't new, just rare for American cars. For American muscle, it was mechanical fuel injection systems. Hilborn supplied a nice system for race cars, and Rochester's probably the most well-known street fuel injection system found under the hoods of mid-50s Chevys and C1 and C2 Corvettes, all mechanical. However, there was a company also called Electrojector, a division of the Bendix Corporation, developing an electronic fuel injection system that ended up under the hoods of a few Chrysler 300s. To see how well they did, or didn't do, spoiler alert, they were all recalled, check out my video on the first generation Chrysler Hemi. Getting back to Electrojector, one particular Bendix employee, David Long, decided to leave in 1968 to start his own company, Conelec, a contraction of Consolidated Electric. Conelec's claim to fame were low-pressure, high-volume electric fuel pumps that were popular with race teams. However, where Bendix never really connected, Conelec capitalized on. Working with Shelby Automotive, the Conelec system was leaps and bounds of have anything you'd find on a Stingray. In fact, Fred Goodell said that it was 10 years ahead of its time in 1968. You see, while the Rochester fuel injection system was innovative, and to be honest, a beautiful piece of machinery, it was all mechanical. The Conelec system was a computer-controlled, multi-port fuel injection system in 1968. Obviously nothing like today's standards, but the Green Hornet ran 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds and 0 to 100 in 11.4. It would have moved performance and efficiency along by leaps and bounds if it had made it to production. However, the system did make it into a prototype GT500 that was tested by Car and Driver. It was considerably slower than the Green Hornet, but still made a good impression. While the system was never mass-produced, it was installed on a number of 68, 69, and 70 Shelbys for experimentation purposes. Many of them still exist today. The Green Hornet survived throughout the decades and was eventually purchased by David Jackson of Barrett Jackson in 2003. In 2018, it was sent to Billups Classic Cars for full restoration in anticipation for the introduction of the 2020 Shelby GT500. Thanks to people like Jason Billups, Pete Disher, and Chris Long, son of David Long, the Green Hornet still exists, running the Connelec fuel injection, independent rear suspension, and four-wheel disc brakes it was originally equipped with. It runs better today than it ever did. Let's face it, the 1966 Shelby GT350 Hertz was lightning in a bottle. There was nothing like it before, nor will there ever be anything like it again, but you can't say they didn't try. In 1967, Shelby tried to woo Hertz into another contract by commissioning A.O. Smith to build a special GT350 convertible and Cougar hardtop as special Hertz-only vehicles, but Hertz walked away from the deal. However, not before purchasing a few hundred special edition Cougars. Finally, in 1968, Hertz purchased around 230 68 GT350s for their rental program. However, these weren't special H cars. They were standard GT350 fastbacks equipped, like all other Shelby Cobras, with power steering and brakes. All of the purchased cars were also automatic equipped, and most came with air conditioning. In all, the 1968 model year run produced a grand total of 4,450 cars. Compared to previous years, 1968 was no doubt the smoothest production run to date. The cars represented well as good-looking, finished products, and mid-year changes were kept to a minimum. The fiberglass body pieces were all sourced from the same manufacturer for the first time, and the quality was the best it's ever been. I'm sure Carroll Shelby wasn't as involved as he would have liked, but at the same time, he could see that working with Ford has changed so drastically that it wasn't enjoyable anymore. 1968 would be the last year of Carroll Shelby's direct involvement in the development of the Cobra GT350 and GT500. The 68 Shelby Cobra was an extension of the 67, but better. It was everything the 67 was, but more of it. Everything the 67 couldn't be, the 68 was. It was an all-around road car that had a little something for everybody. The GT350 provided the class, the GT500 and KR provided the muscle, and the convertible provided a bit of fun to the trifecta that was the 1968 model year. 1969 would bring an even greater deviation from the looks of the Mustang, but relied even more on production Mustang parts. Could it be the best Shelby yet? Stay tuned.